Our final example of artificial selection is antibiotic resistance, which is a problem in our culture today. So, to understand antibiotic resistance, we have to remember that there are a number of different, there's variations in all populations. So, here we have a variation in the bacteria's resistance. So, the more red it is, the more resistant it is. And the more yellow it is, the less resistant it is. So if this is our population filled with all sorts of variation, we're going to administer some antibiotics, which is going to kill off the least resistant bacteria. And so what we've done is we've left the most resistant bacteria. And so it has now more space and more food to proliferate and to make a more resistant population. And so we've done this again and again and again. And so we've seen the population of many strains of bacteria become more resistant. And once again, we are in a race with many types of bacteria to try and make sure that we have a defense against them. And so this is a change in the population over time that we have induced. I'm sorry, there's one more example of artificial selection that we see with farming. And we have vast, huge fields in farming, and there's no way that we could weed all of these farms or all of these gardens. If this is all corn here, there's no way we could pick all the weeds from that. And so we spray herbicides. And so if these are our weeds, and we have one just variation that occurs because variation occurs naturally. And so let's just say there's an ion pump that won't allow for the herb to take up the herbicide. Then it's resistant to the herbicide. And so after we spray the field, we spray this whole field here, we're going to kill off most of the weeds, but we've left the resistant weeds. And so now we've left more room for resistant weeds, and so the population of resistant weeds becomes greater, and then over time even greater. And so we have seen this with one example is Roundup or glyphosate. This is an example of artificial selection and a problem that we have with making sure that we're going to be able to have crops in the future. So that was evolution through artificial selection, and now we are talking about the selective pressures coming from nature, no longer from humans. And so if we look at an example here with amphipods, this is a crustacean found in the ocean. And it looks like here that fitness is determined by size and therefore its ability to swim away from predators. And if we have two large amphipods that produced 4 amphipods, one being small, how did this small amphipod arise from 2 big ones? Well, it might have been in its genotype, and and hidden, just not expressed. And here it's now being expressed, and we can see the phenotype. But we can see that 2 of the big and slow amphipods were eaten, and so we mate the residual, and our population becomes smaller, and the big and small disappear because they're eaten. And we can now see that our population has changed over time. And the selective pressure here was nature. It was predators. And so natural selection is driven through a few of these key ideas that individuals produce an excess of offspring. And not all of these offspring are going to survive. So many of these, one amphipod here, or one pair of amphipods, is going to produce hundreds of larvae, and not all of them are going to survive. And that's why they produce so many of these larvae, because many of them are delicious and will be eaten. It also is based on the fact that differences can be passed on to generations. So the difference here is that it was the small trait was passed on, and that the differences in the traits are associated with differences in the ability to survive. So here, the small trait allowed it to survive, and that was different from the large trait, which allowed it to be caught. And so this is the basis of natural selection. With the amphipods, we saw how natural selection worked towards one solution to the problem of being caught by predators. Here we can see how natural selection can favor multiple solutions to a problem. So here our problem is going to be to survive in a hot, arid desert. And one example of this is going to be the mesquite tree. The mesquite tree is going to grow long tap roots. They spread out long and deep, and they are going to have access to more water and allow the tree to survive because its ability to draw in water. Succulents have a waxy coat. You can see on this cactus here, they have a waxy coat that limits the amount of transpiration that's going to happen. That's the evaporation through the leaves or through the plant itself. And so they can hold in more water. And cacti are also going to be able to grow spines. And this is cool. This shades the plant, which is going to reduce the heat and the transpiration. Annuals are plants that are going to die back during the hot, dry season and then come back when the weather permits, sort of like how our annuals die off in the winter. So evolution can happen through small steps, like through natural selection and artificial selection, but it can also happen through random processes, things that are by chance. The 5 random processes that we're going to talk about are mutation, gene flow, genetic drift, bottleneck, and founder effect. We already talked about mutations, so let's get through this quickly. So mutations are can be beneficial for a population, and that's referred to as an adaptation. So as adaptations grow and species change, genetic material changes, and that is evolution. Evolution is changes in the DNA over time. Gene flow is our next random process. And so if we see here, we're looking at Florida panthers. Our Florida panthers are represented by a kinked tail. And through habitat destruction, panther populations have been reduced and also separated. So the populations are becoming inbred, and that leads to sick panthers. So what we did is we brought in panthers from Texas, and this has changed the genetic diversity of the panthers because it introduced more genes. And so this is gene flow. It has allowed the panthers to become less sick, and it has been successful. The next example of a random process is genetic drift. And this basically, if you remember that chance plays a larger role in small populations. So if we look at the population, a small population of mice, and if we make a change to this population, let's say that one mouse doesn't breed for some reason, and that mouse ends up being just this one black one. It doesn't have the opportunity to reproduce. And that's going to have a big effect on the population because we have lost quite a bit of diversity in this. However, if we look at a larger population, if one mouse here doesn't have the opportunity to reproduce, well, the next generation isn't really affected as much. And so chance plays a larger role in small populations and sometimes less of a role in larger populations. The bottleneck effect is our next random process, and we're going to look at cheetahs here. And the bottleneck effect is going to occur when we reduce a population for any reason, whether it's habitat loss, a natural disaster, harvesting by humans, or just natural changes in the environment. And so if we see the cheetah is famously known for having low genetic diversity. About 10,000 years ago, for some reason, its population is hypothesized to have been, as small as a dozen or even less cheetahs, and so it has it has a bottleneck. And so if we look at the concept of a bottleneck here, we have spotted cheetahs, we have no spotted cheetahs, and then large spot cheetahs. And if we make our population really small, for some reason these are harvested or they die off or something happens, but our population dies back and we have only 3, well, now we have reduced the amount of genetic diversity. So even if we get tons more cheetahs, even if these few cheetahs reproduce and reproduce, it's going to take millions and millions of years to get more genetic diversity. So over the 10,000 years or so of reproduction within cheetahs, there's still very limited genetic diversity. And finally, the last random process is the founder effect. And this is what happens when we take a small sample of a population and for some reason we remove that population and place it somewhere else. Let's say a small portion of birds are moved to an island and they're going to reproduce. Well, the direction of this population looks like maybe it'll become more red over time, but the direction of this population certainly looks like the yellow trait is dominant. The yellow trait may not be as dominant over here, but the yellow trait is definitely dominant over here. So if this population grows, it's going to have a different genetic combination or a different composition to it. So it is a new population, and while it comes from an old population, its composition is going to be different just because of where it began or the components of it when it started. And so when we look at a famous example in the Amish country, there were at least one person that had polydactyly in the beginning of the community. And that trait has been passed down and passed down and passed down. And so where that trait is not common in many places, it is common in the Amish country. And that is because the composition of their community, the gene pool is going to be different than the gene pool of everyone else because our gene pools have been separated for many generations. And that is module 15, and I look forward to seeing you in class.